Can we trust the words of Christ if there have been so many copies of Scripture?
Yes, we can, because fortunately we can go back in time. We can compare a copy that was written, say, in the 800s with a copy that was written in the 300s and still be in the original language of the Greek New Testament. And then we can go even further back. We can compare a handwritten copy made in 350 AD with something that was written in about the 200 AD. And therefore we can see the trustworthiness of these copies. What I want to help people to see, therefore, is that we really can, with great confidence, say that we've got an accurate and reliable record of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. He really did say that, and he really did do that. There is a very controversial copy, though. It's actually called the most controversial of all the copies. What makes it fascinating is that
some say that the New Testament in the Bible has been hopelessly distorted, while others claim that it's the most reliably preserved document of antiquity. Let's sort the myth from the manuscript. Today I have with me Jonathan Clerke, who's an author and apologist and has written and studied extensively on how Jesus' words and actions were written down. His book, The Echoes of Jesus, has been translated into 3 languages, and he teaches on this topic around the world. So, Jonathan, let's start with a question. Can you tell me what sparked your interest to investigate the reliability of the New Testament text?
I remember one of my colleagues very early on when I became a Christian saying to me, "John, what do you mean you become a Christian? You don't honestly believe that Jesus actually said what you're reading in the Bible?" Wow. He told me they're all illiterate shepherds. No one could read or write back then. And I didn't have any answers for him. And so, we all have questions when we look at the Bible and look at Jesus, but it's surprising how many questions there are to ask. So that was a really big part of my journey. And then I saw a need for something that would be appealing to those who don't already have a relationship with Jesus. I could see that there was no book already in existence that was a friendly read for people who didn't know anything about Jesus, didn't know anything about history, but they wanted to see the evidence for themselves. And I think it's very important that people get the opportunity to look at the evidence and make a decision for themselves.
I certainly notice in my classrooms as a teacher, you have Christian kids that want to know the answers to these questions, but you also have a lot of non-Christian students who'd like to know. So that makes it an amazing resource.
Yes.
How important would you say it is for Christians and skeptics to understand where the Bible actually came from?
Yeah. For those people who already have a relationship with Jesus, some of them wonder about why spend all this effort, because we can feel Jesus. They have experiential relationship with Jesus where they have no doubt that he's there, like they have no doubt that they love their daughter or their son, for instance, and that their son and their daughter is real. But inevitably in life, bad things happen. Your baby might die of cancer at the age of 6 months. In those dark times, it's so easy for people to suddenly wonder, were those memories that I have of my relationships with Jesus, were they real? Where is this all-powerful, all-knowing God that's meant to love me so much? And people start to be motivated more to answer the basic questions which experience alone can't help. The other issue for people, of course, is those who don't know Jesus. This can be a real stumbling block. Like, imagine that you're sitting with a friend and it's at a new workplace, and you ask your friend, "What did you do on the weekend?" And of course, most people say, "Well, what did you do on the weekend?" You say, "I went to church." And the person, if it's in Australia, might say, "Oh, that's a bit odd. What do you do in church?" "Oh, well, we sing to Jesus as a group." And people go, "Oh, okay, this is getting weird." It's getting weird. And then we listen to someone teach. What does he teach about? Or what does she teach about? Well, he's teaching about what Jesus said in John chapter 14. What's John? Well, that's a book in the Bible, book in the New Testament called John's Gospel, and it's got these words that Jesus said. Well, what did Jesus say? He said, well, Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." Most people who've never met a Christian before will probably say, did he really say that? Because we so often think of Jesus as a healer, maybe. We don't often, many people outside of the church circles anyhow, that would probably be, if you say, what do you think of Jesus? They think of him dying, and then maybe the second thing is they think of him healing. They don't usually think of him saying really outrageous statements that seem like really egotistical. So your friend would say, did he really say that? And I want to be able to help people to see with confidence that there's evidence for believing, yes, he really did say that.
Okay. We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but first I'd like to thank you for watching these videos. And if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe and ring that notification bell, as it helps us create more content like this. Let's get back to the interview.
So if we're talking about the things that he has actually said, do we know when they were written down? When did they become text? The things he said, the things he did? Do we know when?
Yeah, we can't prove this because we can't go back in our time machines and have a look there. But we do have an understanding of what culture was like. Very briefly, there are various scholars around the world, like Robert Gundry, a guy called B. Ward Powers, another guy called William Hendrickson, who've been talking for decades about the likelihood that when Jesus was doing things and saying things, they were actually taking notes.
The people listening?
The people listening to Jesus and the people watching Jesus heal somebody, that people were actually able to take notes. So I thought, well, what evidence is there that is so? I mean, it's very fine for Robert Gundry to say this, but either why did he say it or can I see the evidence for myself? So that embarked on this journey of discovery about, well, journey of investigation really, just how were people able to take notes? Was there that culture?
Did he have evidence?
Yeah. Well, we always, in science, we like to go back to the primary source material. So I'm always trying to go back as far as I can to read, say, what was the discovery that was actually made, what was the raw bones of it.
Yeah.
And so it is fascinating. So in my generation, we didn't have tape recorders that you could readily carry around with you. So you went to a lecture and you had to take notes, as a lecturer at university would be speaking 1,000 words a minute. And you were wishing that you had been like your other friends who didn't go to university but learnt a thing called shorthand. So shorthand's a way of writing down what you are hearing but really quickly, because you're not trying to write letters, you're trying to make strokes that make sounds. So it means they can be really quick. And what I was fascinated in was, well, did they have something like that? Did they have like a shorthand that enabled them to listen to a lawyer or a politician or a preacher and take notes at the same time? And I found, yes, they did.
Wow.
Yeah. So Marcus, a guy called Marcus Cicero, so some of the people listening might have heard of that. He was born about 106 BC. He died about 43 BC. He was an amazing guy. He was a lawyer, a philosopher, and a senator. And he had a team of shorthand writers working in the Senate for him. So we go, wow, they did have shorthand in that sort of a bureaucratic environment. So I thought, well, that's saying something. Yeah.
Did it seem very different to the shorthand that we know today?
I don't know much about what that shorthand was, but I do gather it was certainly talked about as being extremely efficient. There were several shorthand languages in the West. We had 2 different ones in Australia, by the way. Yeah. So a forgotten craft now, forgotten craft.
Definitely.
So there was Cicero doing that, and you'd say, well, he was a philosopher and maybe that's what they do. Maybe nobody else did shorthand. But there's an emperor, a Roman emperor. He was ruling Rome between 79 AD and 81 AD. So this is after Jesus had died. And in those 2 years, he made a real name for himself, and he made a name for himself beforehand. So in about 70 AD, he was the commander of the forces that levelled Jerusalem, which was a huge massacre. About 1 million people died in that war. So he earned his laurels, as they say, and eventually became emperor. So you think of this guy, this sword-wielding commander guy, he was good at shorthand. The historian Suetonius said that he was very fast at shorthand and he loved to have competitions with his secretaries. But I do wonder whether the secretaries always made sure he won.
Surely.
Yes, you'd think so.
Okay.
So then I thought, okay, so it's not just in the legal arena that people knew shorthand. There's also this ability to take notes that existed outside of that arena. And then I thought, well, what about way outside of that? What about in the countryside? Did they have an ability to write so fast that they could take notes? There was a professor, Alan Millard is his name. He unfortunately died last year in 2024. He was a professor of Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages. Semitic just means like Jewish language, Hebrew language, Arabic language, Aramaic language. So this is his forte, this area of study. He was at the University of Liverpool before he died. And he said this about Palestine. Now, Palestine was different back then. So it was like a state like Queensland, and it was a state that the Romans called Syria-Palestine. And they called it that after there was another Jewish rebellion against the Romans in about 132 to 135 AD. So the Romans had enough of the Jewish population at that stage. They banned the people from there, and then to rub it in, they said you can't call it Judea anymore, as in Jews and Judas. So it's now going to be called Syria-Palestine. So that should geographically help people. Okay, this is where Jesus was, this area of the world. That's where he was supposedly teaching and healing people and saying outrageous things about himself. So Professor Alan Millard said this as a concluding statement. He said, the evidence is so strong that throughout Palestine, so that big area, even in the rural areas, he said, so even in the countryside, there were people who were proficient at writing, that they could write about their daily business lives. And then he had this, and that they could take notes of a preacher's words if they wanted to. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting insight as to how widespread this culture could have been or was for taking notes when you listen to someone preach.
We're not just talking about nobility. We're not just talking about lawyers. We're talking about even the common person.
Yeah. And common people in this particular context, what we're talking about being Jesus's followers, is a highly motivated context. We're not talking about maybe a grade 10 boy trying to learn some poetry from Shakespeare. You know, he may not be very motivated or she may not be very motivated to learn this or to make sure that it's in their memory. But you imagine if you're one of Jesus's disciples, you've given up everything, you have seen this guy do miracles. He seems to be wanting to create a whole new system. He talks about a new covenant, a new agreement between God and man. He talks about that you're probably going to die following me. He's talking about serious aspects. So Jesus also prophesied about the fact that he was going to be crucified and spat at and tortured to death. So you sort of get the sense that Jesus has got a motivation to make sure his disciples remember things and take notes. And the people listening to him, they're strongly motivated to also certainly memorise, but if you've got the culture around you that is already a culture of note-taking, or at least some subcultures are, what would you do? Or you've left your career, you're on the road, I think you'd be taking notes, or at least somebody in your group of 12 would be.
Yeah, when you paint the picture like that, it almost seems like the opposite. Why wouldn't you? Yes, of course you would be. It just seems logical.
Well said, yeah.
What about what they were taking notes on? So I've certainly heard the comment that it might be too expensive to be able to afford, the writing materials you needed. Is that true?
I guess for many people, they have the memory of, or they've heard somewhere that they wrote on parchment, animal skins. And then everyone immediately thinks, well, that was probably a sheep or a cow, something you could eat, and there'd be some leftover skin. But they also understand that's probably going to be expensive. The good news is that you didn't have to use that material.
Okay.
So we know a little bit about this because of some really incredible discoveries. So a place called Vindolanda, which was part of the Roman Empire at one stage. This is in the area of England that is just to the far north of the extent of what the Roman Empire managed to take over in England.
Yeah.
They didn't get to take over all of it. So this is just south of the dividing line between what is Roman Britain and what is not. And they had a fort there. And in this fort, they found these wooden writing leaves. So they're shaves or thin layers of wood, some of them only 1 millimetre thick, some of them 3 millimetre thick. They're about 20 centimetres by 9 centimetres, so smallish pieces of wood, but they were very cheap to make. And they found hundreds of these. They found 1,400 of what we call wooden leaf tablets, like you turn over a leaf in the book, so to speak. And so they're very thin. And they were written on with black ink. So two things is amazing. One, that they've been preserved, because all of this was written down roughly mostly around the 100s AD. So before 130 AD, but most of them around that 100 AD. So Jesus died, and we would say rose again about 33 AD. So we're talking that same era. So far they've dug up at least 1,400 of these leaves that you can still read bits of. So that's pretty incredible news. In 2023, they found another 12. So the count keeps going up every year as they keep finding more and more of these. So that's our insight into, okay, there really was cheap writing materials. But they had more than that. They had actually things called wooden wax tablets. So these were like little wooden trays. So they had a wooden margin, and in the middle of it they would pour wax. They let it settle, and now you've got a nice soft surface to use with a metal stylus, like a metal pointy pen or something, and you could write on the wax. And of course when you're finished with it, you just melt it and put on another layer, and then you can write it.
Wow.
And what's fascinating is some people are heavy-handed, and when they wrote, their stylus went all the way through to the wood, so we can read what they were writing too. And so there are thousands of these. In fact, all through the Roman Empire there are thousands of these. And as far back as 500 years before Jesus was born, some of them were in pairs. So they had some thread through to hold them together. So they're obviously notepads, as we would call them. Think of spiral notepads, unless you've only got your phone these days with your notebook app. And that was what they were using the equivalent of. So once again, a really cheap resource to use to write. Yeah, wow. So there's a few ways in which we know that there was cheap writing materials around. And then, of course, there was papyrus, which was made from plant material. And that was also much cheaper than having to kill an animal and then make use of the skin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is evidence that it didn't necessarily, to write, you didn't necessarily need to be rich.
No, that's right. So certainly not only could the rich people easily buy lots of this material, but even the poor people could easily buy it. And this is a very important thing. So when I was talking about the Vindolanda discoveries, we actually know who wrote those tablets. So there's about 750 men in the fort, and they had their wives with them. They had some slaves with them. They had some tradies or tradespersons, I shouldn't say tradies, people coming in selling merchandise. They had some of those material. People from other towns had written on their wooden leaf tablets and sent them across to this fort. So people were receiving the mail in this version. Wow. There are letters there from low-rank officers. There are letters there from officers with no rank. There are letters from the slaves or written by slaves. The wives had some very interesting things to say. There was one lady's letter, I've forgotten her name now. She wrote, I hope you are well. I know, she started off this way, I am well and all is good. I hope you are well. You neglectful man, I have not received one letter from you. And then she went on to skite about how many letters she had written. So women all through the centuries are upset at how rare their men communicate, especially when they're in a war zone. Yeah.
It's probably the same today.
No, I think it's very much the same today. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we got that idea that, okay, there are different types of people writing way back in that era of Jesus' time. And then it goes further than that, because we know that people would sometimes use all sorts of writing material. And so sometimes on walls, for instance, but then it's stuck there. So sometimes people were writing on ostraca, which is basically often bits of broken pottery and things like that. So there's ways in which you could take notes and get by. Yeah.
And the people listening to Jesus and watching what he was doing when he was here would have been anyone from these people that we're talking about, the poor, all the way up to the rich and the nobility, and all these different types of levels of society represented there.
People often sometimes think of the disciples as just maybe a fisherman, but what in reality was, that was his business. And he made enough of a business out of it to look after a family and to have a home. I was fascinated in trying to work out, well, how much did it cost in real money? Show me the money. How much did it actually cost to buy some of this stuff? So there's a guy called Marshall, we call him Marshall. His real name was Marcus Martialis. He was born about 38 AD, so shortly after Jesus died. He wrote, we know, at least 1,561 short, witty poems. They were mostly obscene. Well, a lot of them were obscene. He knew that sex sold.
Okay.
So he wrote these sort of poems. And we know how much a slender book of his poems sold for. And I thought, well, we don't exactly know how big a slender book of poems are, but at least I got now an idea of a price of a book. And it was 2 to 4 sesterci. I thought, well, is that $2,000 to $4,000 notes, or is that 2 to 4 1-cent coins? What is it? So then I wanted to find a comparison. So keep in mind that you could buy a slender volume of Marshall's poems, which were generally quite witty, for 2 to 4. You could also buy for 2 to 3 sesterci a litre of olive oil, which goes a long way. For 5 sesterci, you could buy a jar of wine. And more relevant to a lot of blokes, for only 2 sesterci, you could buy half a pint of beer almost. So I thought, well, this is very affordable. You know, people could actually afford these sort of materials. You know, if that was how much it cost to buy something that somebody had already written and composed something, the raw materials have got to be cheaper. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Fascinating. What about, I was thinking, when we are, if we imagine these people taking notes as they're seeing what Jesus is saying and as they're, hearing what Jesus is saying and seeing what he's doing, the miracles that he's performing, wouldn't they, if they're not a historian, when they're writing this down, could they be, even without realising it, bringing their own biases into it if they don't understand how to write history down properly? Couldn't that be affecting what they actually then wrote?
Yeah, very much. It's interesting. How to write history is a scientific and a discipline in itself, and they call it historiography, the study of how people have written the history of something, or how to write history, full stop.
Okay.
And so basically a lot of people today would say, well, if you're writing history, you probably need to make sure you got your facts straight. Probably need to make sure that those people you hate, you don't particularly exaggerate against, and those people you love, you don't particularly exaggerate too much in that direction either. But people wonder, well, how long ago did we have these understandings? So back in Jesus' time, so once again, he died about 33 AD, and many of us Christians, all Christians, believe he came back to life again forever. So a guy called Lucian of Samosata was the town, his first name was Lucian. He was a prolific writer, and he was born about 120 AD, so about 90 years after Jesus had been teaching and whatever. And he wrote a book called How to Write History. And it wasn't new, but he talked about how history, this is his words translated into English via me, history abhors the least falsehood. In other words, if you're going to write history, there shouldn't be anything false in it whatsoever. History should tell it as it happened. In other words, you should be seeing something and that's what you should write down.
Report the facts.
Report the facts, exactly. And history, a good historian will not let his personal favourites or those he hate colour his writing. So that was Lucian of Samosata.
Sounds pretty on the money.
Yeah, he was on the money. He was on the money in many ways. He was also our first science fiction writer. Yeah, he wrote a book about aliens back then.
Wow.
Yeah, on moon and in the sun. They could swap their eyeballs with each other. A fascinating guy. Yeah. Not a Christian at all, definitely not. But that's another topic, because he did talk about Christians.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, so that was Lucian, about the time of Jesus. But we can go even further back. So back in the 400s, there was a Greek guy called Thucydides. And he wrote about a big war, a Peloponnesian War. It's basically between two big states in Greece.
Yep.
Massive war that didn't get resolved despite a lot of deaths at that particular point in time. And many people regard him as probably the father of history in many ways. And he wrote these same basic principles about how to write history, that you should try to be an eyewitness. And so, and a good historian is actually an eyewitness. So then if you're watching Jerusalem get sacked and 1 million people be destroyed, you should be, we would say the journalists, they would say you should be the historian, you should be writing it as it is. And then he said that, and if you can't be the eyewitness, this is paraphrasing, then you need to interview eyewitnesses. You need to try to get back to the source, like I did with my book.
Yeah.
And then you need to cross-examine them, we would say. He would say you need to make sure that one witness checks out with another witness's story. So people have had for a long time this terrific understanding about how to tell the truth in a way that would resonate with us. In fact, there's a professor, Lester Grabe, Grabbe. He was from the University of Hull. Pretty sure he's still alive, actually. Should say hello in case he's watching this. He said that the Greco-Roman historian basically was working on the same principles as we do, that the first priority is to take down the facts as you see them and so faithfully follow the data and accurately present the data. And so there's Greco-Roman historians by and large, and for most of what they were generally doing in some of their books, obviously some were good quality and some weren't, were following these principles. And we know that this history was very popular because the history books were often in the libraries.
Okay. Is there any evidence that the New Testament writers themselves actually understood these principles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I read, like, it's fun reading the Gospels. So, you know, those people don't know the lingo. That's just the sort of historical, biographical accounts of Jesus. We call them Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. You know, when you just sit down and pick them up like you're picking up any other article and just read them with a fresh mind, it's very enlightening. It's a nice thing to do even if you've studied them for years. And you pick up different things. I remember when I was reading in John chapter 6, Jesus does this big miracle. He feeds 5,000 men, and that's not counting the women and children that we presume were definitely there. So he does this with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, so an incredible miracle. But then he follows it up with a teaching session, and he teaches about how he's the bread of life. That's all he's done. So he's gone around, he's healed lots of people, so people are keen to get healed or to see, you know, what's all the fuss about.
Yeah.
They go and they get this great miraculous free lunch. There really is such a thing as a free lunch. Jesus hits them with a sermon, and then it says in John chapter 6, verse 66, most of these disciples, these followers, left him. Now, if I was writing an account about Jesus and I was not following historical principles, I would probably leave that out. It doesn't look really good to say that the guy you're willing to die for lost most of his followers after he'd done all these miracles. As soon as he opened his mouth, they left him. Would you really leave that in? I don't think so. Yeah.
Were there other examples of
Oh, yeah, there are. You know, so Jesus had these 12 guys following him. Some people would probably say he would have done better if he had 6 women and 6 men, but let's leave it at that for another time. So he had these 12 guys following him. And at one stage he said to a couple of the guys, look, you go ahead of us. Oh, no, maybe he's tired and walking slow. Go ahead of me to this town and I want you to tell them to make arrangements to welcome us. And these 2 guys, James and John, come back and they're really angry. They said they're not interested in welcoming you. There's no hint that they were going to be hostile. They just didn't want to make a fuss, is what I read it as. So definitely not hostile. And they said to Jesus, can you rain down fire from heaven and destroy them? No, I would say, well, If my 3-year-old granddaughter said something like that, I could understand it, you know.
Having a little hissy fit about it.
Having a hissy fit. So once again, to me, that's signs that whoever was writing this, which I do believe were the early disciples, whoever was recording this, memorising this, they were able to make sure they made a faithful record of all that was happening around Jesus, not just what he said, not just what he did, but even what they were like as this group of 12 that are dedicating year after year of their life to learning everything they can from him as a full-time activity. Yeah.
And as you said before, it does seem like they would have been conscious that as they were taking notes, this was important, this was big. And so any awareness about recording history factually and as they see it would have been probably on their minds.
Yeah, and Jesus several times said to his guys, I'm going to be crucified. You know, I'm going to be tortured to death. And so they had no idea, of course. You know, looking back, we can say, oh, you got 3 years, guys, don't panic. But they didn't know when this was going to happen. So much stronger the motivation to memorise and to take notes and to make sure something coherent was going to be there. Because he also told them that if they hate me, they will hate you. And so that would have also given them an understanding. We need to make sure that we've got others that are disciples of us, and they also need to have records because they're not going to be so fortunate to have heard us as eyewitnesses. And you see this, you know, in there's another little book in the Bible called 2 Peter. And in this book he says, in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, just a way of referencing it, he says, we were eyewitnesses of this. So once again, there's that understanding that it's important that you make sure that anything you hear is from an eyewitness, and we were eyewitnesses. We're worth listening to. They're
establishing such credibility.
Right. And there's another gospel. That wasn't a gospel. There's a gospel called Luke. It's written by a doctor. It's very chronologically arranged in general. And his first opening words are these. I still love them. This is just a paraphrase. So Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. He says that many have undertaken, many have already tried to make an account of all of what Jesus has said and done. So once again, this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. King Jono's version, you can call it, King John's version. So, and so insofar as others have tried to make this account, I too am writing. Or in some versions says, I saw that fitting that me as well will write. So he's already saying there, others have already started this writing process. I'm not the first guy. So the evidence is there. Yeah.
Wow. You mentioned libraries before, and I wanted to come back to that because I don't picture I don't know what to picture when you think about libraries in biblical times. Can you elaborate on this?
But yeah, they had libraries. So one of their famous libraries of history is a library in Egypt. So the north of Egypt is not really that far from Israel, where Jesus was walking and talking, in Judea, in other words. And so there was this city called Alexandria. It still exists today. 220 years before Jesus was born, a guy, a lord, a king, got it in his head that I want to start a big library. And it just grew and grew and grew. And so 48 years before Jesus was born, there was an historian called Aulus Gellius. So in 48 BC, he's writing that the library in Alexandria at that time had 700,000 scrolls.
Wow.
Which we think makes up, maybe we're estimating, about 100,000 different titles. So that's a lot of reading material.
It's not a small library.
It's not a small library. Now that's in Egypt. In Turkey, there's a city called Pergamon. They had a library with about 200,000 scrolls, roughly around that 160 BC. And then Rome in Italy. So obviously Christianity found its way to Italy, hence we have letters to Christians in Rome. We call it the Book of Romans. They had a library there. They had a lot of libraries. But one of the libraries I know about is one built by the Emperor Trajan in AD 112, and they had roughly 20,000 scrolls. So there were libraries everywhere.
And is there evidence that you would have been able to, the common person could have used the library perhaps like we do today?
Definitely. They talk about how rich and poor were welcome, old and young, and the rich and poor would want to go there. They had cold water plunge pools. They had steam rooms. They had massage rooms.
Wow, I want that kind of library today.
Yeah, that's right. Right to your Lord Mayor. Hey, look, we're 2,000 years behind the times, guys, you know. And they had gardens you could walk through. Wow. You could listen to an interesting speaker of your choice. At least a couple of the libraries you could actually borrow a book. So we know that about a library in Tibur, Tibur, near not too far from Rome, as far as Australian distances are concerned. And we also know about a library in Athens that lent out at least one book. So we've got this understanding that there were these massive libraries, that people were welcome there.
And how does that impact the topic that we're talking about at the moment?
Yeah, so we're talking about, is it realistic to believe that when Jesus was saying these outlandish things like, I am the way, the truth, the life, no one comes to the Father. In other words, no one gets to go to God in heaven where it's going to be really nice, but through me. You know, really amazing statement. I would say we've got all the evidence under the sun to say that, yes, he really said that. So what I'm painting is this picture that it was just commonplace for people, not common like today, but there was commonplace to have a variety of people from all walks of life in terms of economic status being able to read and write. There might not have been 80% of poor people who can read and write. There might not have been 80% of rich people who could read and write. But there were people in all these different strata who could read and write. And Jesus, of course, if he is who he said he is, he would have known who was going to be good at remembering. He would have been known who was good at probably taking notes. That's probably why he picked Matthew. Many people think the disciple Matthew was probably the guy. Of course, he had a job in the tax office, and he would have been used to writing quickly and probably spoke several languages. Okay. So all of this paints a picture of very literate cultures. And everywhere you look, it just gets more and more strong. So one of the times I was thinking about, well, how else can I help people to see it wasn't just the rich? And I thought, graffiti. You know, most of us, when you think about graffiti, you don't think it's just the rich that are writing on the back of the toilet door. You know, most of you are going to think, well, anyone could have written that graffiti, and certainly some of them were probably poor people. Some of them may be rich and using a public toilet, I don't know.
And so they had graffiti?
They had a lot of graffiti.
Oh, where did they write it?
Well, I'll give you an example. So you might appreciate this. I gather you're a mum. Yeah, so there's a town in Syria, not too far north of where Jesus was, called Dura Europa. So it's on the Euphrates River. And this place in the 200s to 300s, it ceased to have anybody living there from about 262 AD by memory. So anything that's written there was written before then. The place is ruins, but there are ruins of houses there. And 1/3 of the houses have graffiti on the inside walls. So they were encouraging their families to write on the inside walls of their houses. Now, not all the walls are full length anymore. So I think if you had full length walls, you would have seen graffiti on maybe 75% of the houses. And it was in Hebrew, in Aramaic, it was in Arabic, it was in Greek, it was in Latin. Some of it was bilingual. You could tell by the style of handwriting.
Do we know what they were writing about?
I don't know that particular place, but we can come back to that. They were in the small houses, so the poorer people's houses. There was graffiti on the inside walls of the bigger houses. They wrote on the forts. They wrote everywhere. And it was just a normal, everyday town in the northeast of the Roman Empire. It wasn't some town where there was this U-boot library called Alexandria. It wasn't a town where all the philosophers loved to hang out and have lunch and have a shindig with each other. It was just a normal town, and there's all this writing there. And it was all through. So Pompeii's on the other side of the water in Italy, and some people might know it because they've been there. Of course, there was a big volcano eruption in 79 AD. So once again, you think back to Jesus, you know, he died 33 AD, so not too far away from then. And the volcano issued out a lot of dust, volcanic dust. So it turned a lot of people's bodies into mummies almost instantly. So tourists go there to see these mummified bodies, basically. But it's a great place to see graffiti. There's at least 5,000 pieces of graffiti scratched into walls just in Pompeii.
Whoa.
One wall's got this little ditty on it. It says, "Dear wall, I'm amazed that you have not fallen down in ruins, because you have so much written, tedious graffiti, tedious writings written on you." So it was just that prolific. And there they wrote about gladiators sometimes. They wrote about the mundane things of life. They wrote about politics, just like any intelligent graffiti artist would. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I find that evidence very compelling, because the people who decipher and discover this, they say that this writing is not all from one socioeconomic class. This is from all levels of society.
You've made that very clear.
Yes.
That's fantastic. So if we are seeing such evidence that the New Testament authors would have been able to take good notes, potentially known how to write this down well, afforded being able to write this on something, let's have a look at the actual manuscripts that we have, the evidence that we've found. Do we have any of the originals?
You would think that we might, given that we've got some material that's written on the wooden relief tablets, for instance, that goes back to roughly that time. But no, we don't have any of the originals we believe we don't have any of the originals of what was written when Jesus was walking and talking. So the original Gospels we're talking about. So when you open your Bible, that finished product that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and all the other books in the Bible. But we do have some very old copies of copies.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for instance, our oldest complete copy, I still get surprised at this, our oldest complete copy of the New Testament in its original language goes back to the 300s AD. You know, I can't find a tax receipt from 2 years ago that my accountant wants. And there we go. We've got these written documents of the whole New Testament in one piece. This one's called Codex, which is a fancy word for saying it's in a book format. Codex Sinaiticus, because it was found on Mount Sinai. And so we've got a bunch of these, a small bunch of these very big manuscripts. Now, the manuscript just means they've been written on by hand as opposed to a printing press.
Okay.
So we've got a small number of these ones that contain large portions of the New Testament. They go funny names like Codex Vaticanus, because it was in the Vatican for a long time. And Codex Alexandrinus is another one. But we can go back even further in time. So Codex Sinaiticus, our oldest Greek complete New Testament, written in the 300s, and some of the others I mentioned were in the 400s. But we can go back in time, but now we're looking at more partial copies. And so these are given really boring names, you know.
Okay.
So P66 means papyrus number 66. And so there's P66, which is a bit of the Gospel of John. And then there's papyrus 72, which is a bit of 1 Peter, 2 Peter and Jude. And then there's papyrus 75, which is a bit of Luke. And these are written before 300. So we're going back in time.
Even closer to when Jesus was preaching.
Even closer to the copies of the originals, perhaps. And then we can go back to before 200, but there's not many there, and they're quite small. Yeah. So we've got this treasure trove of material, but unfortunately we don't have the originals.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly. But real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present at close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it becomes a genuine stumbling block to their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today. So we've talked about these copies of the original manuscripts. Therefore, we're relying on the accuracy of these copies. Can we have a discussion about when people were copying these things down, what if they were deliberately making some changes or accidentally making changes? Can we talk about some examples?
Yeah, sure. And so that is the beauty of the fact that we've got all these ancient copies, some being copies of copies of copies of copies, and some being copies of copies, perhaps of the master. And so we can compare something that was copied down in roughly 250 AD with something that was also copied by hand but now in 350 AD. So we can look at what changes have happened because there have been changes. As you said, some of them are accidental changes, but some of them look like they're intentional or deliberate. And so we see this as a pattern in a particular copyist. So we tend to name these documents, as I said, like P45. So whoever it was that copied P45, as they were diligently doing their work, they seem to have had a particular way of copying. We would say it was inconsequential, the deliberate changes,
Right.
but this is what I want people to see for themselves. So, for instance, one example of what this copyist of P45 did was when they saw redundancies, they would remove them. So if I'm talking about you wearing a pink-coloured jumper,
Okay.
well, there's a redundancy there. I didn't need to say the word coloured. I just need to say you're wearing a pink jumper.
Okay.
In our New Testament, what looks like the originals look like they had redundancies in them. So, for instance, we read about Jesus feeding the 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And that gets repeated in Mark chapter 6, verses 38 to 41. It gets repeated both in terms of that he miraculously fed them with loaves and fishes, but also gets repeated in terms of it being 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The second time those numbers, those quantities are mentioned, P45 leaves it out. Is that going to be world-shattering? Is that going to change any view of us that we might have of Jesus? Well, no, because 2 verses before it tells us there were 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So it doesn't matter that whoever this copyist was, they didn't bother writing the 5 and 2 a second time. We see another case of it when Jesus is casting out demons. And there's a great debate between some people who are antagonistic towards Jesus about what's the source of his power for casting out demons. They were saying, well, maybe you're demonic and you're just a bigger demon than the demons you're casting out. It sounds really crazy to us. And so over and over and over again, we're reading about demons being cast out. Eventually, the copyist of P45 stops talking about demons being cast out and just talks about being cast out. And it's obvious when you read it, what's being cast out? Well, demons. They've already been mentioned 3 or 4 times before. We don't need to keep having it made clear to us that what's being talked about is demons. So that's an example of someone who's probably making a deliberate change. It's unlikely that was subconscious. But what was the intention of them? Well, they're not trying to create a new doctrine. They're not trying to create a new character of Jesus. They're just trying to make it a faster read. And I don't think anybody would say, well, that's earth-shattering. And but that is an example of someone making deliberate changes. And, of course, if you were to read some of these original research documents about the patterns of copying behaviour, and you read in the abstract that this copyist makes deliberate changes all through her writing or his writing, you'd be very alarmed until you realise, well, it's not consequential. So in my book, I go to a lot of effort to give people a lot of examples about, well, what are the nature of these changes? Some of them were certainly accidental, though.
Okay. What are some examples we could talk about of those?
Sure. Well, let's look at P45. So generally this person was a good copyist, and apart from getting rid of the redundancies. But at one stage, the person seemed to have tired. Maybe their eyes skipped a line. So there's this part in the Bible called Acts in the New Testament. And in Acts chapter 15, it's talking about a letter being written to another group of Christians and having been to be taken there. And this letter is helping these Christians in this other town, Christians who are not from a Jewish background, know how not to irritate their Jewish Christian friends. And so they say to them, well, look, can you please not eat the meat of any strange animals? Don't drink blood, because that's something that the Jewish Christians' cultural background and once theological background said, you don't do that either. You don't eat meat from strange animals, you don't drink blood, and you don't eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol. And then they add, and don't do any sexual immorality. Now, whether some of them were actually involved in sexual immorality or not, I don't know, because like every Christian community, not if you have a Christian community of 100 people, are they all going to be saints? No. And we know that sometimes a letter was written to a Christian community where it told them they needed to stop being sexually inappropriate. So maybe this group of Gentile Christians, maybe there was one out of every 100 or however many, and they said, so you got no sexual immorality. Maybe there were some other reasons for putting it there too that had nothing to do with what they were doing, but just the optics of it, shall we say, and or the rumours that were being spread. Who knows? But P45 left out cease having sexual immorality. So I thought, well, imagine I was a Christian community and the only copy of the New Testament, this portion of the New Testament I had was P45. Would this mean that I suddenly thought that sexual immorality was okay because it's not prohibited there? Well, the good news is no. Jesus really was a teacher, and he often said something more than once. He often sometimes said a little bit differently from time to time. And even though P45, what genuinely looks like an accidental slip, an accidental miss of some words, left it out there, no Christian community who only had P45 would be thinking, oh, good, we can still be sexually immoral. No, because they still would have, Mark chapter 7, for instance, where Jesus says that sexual immorality is something that your old hearts had and you need a new heart. If you've been greedy, you need a new heart, for instance. So that's an example of what we call the onion effect.
Oh, the onion effect. Okay, you better explain that one.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish I was the inventor of some neat little phrases. So the people who study this are called textual critics.
Okay.
Of course, they're having a critical, not in the sense of hypercritical. They're not coming at the text necessarily aggressively. They're just trying to make sure that they are being fair to the text and calling it and telling it as it is, just like a good historian does. So if they genuinely think someone is made an accident, a textual critic will say, well, the evidence is P45 made a mistake and left something out. Or the evidence here is actually P45 looks like she's got the best copy. So how does that work? So Daniel B. Wallace, he's one of these textual critics, and he was trying to explain this to his listeners, and he came up with the onion effect. So he's an American, and they're proud of their Constitution. And in 1787, they had a handwritten copy of their Constitution. And I'm pretty sure it's quite different to our Australian Constitution. I've not actually read it right from the very beginning. I've not read much of it at all, just very select portions. But there's something like this. We, the people of the states, in order to create a perfect union, will do A, B, and C, and D. We'll make sure there's justice in the land, for instance. So everyone might have a copy of 1787 where it says, we, the people, in order to create a more perfect union. Let's say there were 15 copies made, and 100 years later, we've got all 15 copies. But you notice that one of them, it actually says, we, the people, in order to create a more perfect onion, will do A, B, C, and D.
Not union,
Not
onion.
Onion. You think, now how do I know it was not meant to be an onion? Well, you think, well, context tells you for a start. It's unlikely that this is a document about creating the perfect onion. It's not a horticultural document for a start. It's not a document about how to make your recipe taste better than all the other recipes. It's the Constitution of the US. So you could tell by context, and that's a lot of what textual criticism is about. The word that's written there sometimes is a nonsense word. So automatically people go, well, that clearly couldn't have been the intention of the author. They either heard wrong or they were tired or slipped or whatever. And the other thing is that we've got 13 other documents at least, or the 15, that say we the people in order to create a more perfect union. So we've got that advantage. We've got all these copies of copies. Before AD 300, we have at least 75, I think it's about 80 now, portions of the New Testament preserved. And then after 300, of course, we got these big portions of the New Testament preserved. And then after that, there are hundreds and hundreds of Greek handwritten copies of the New Testament. So as these centuries go by, we've got over 5,000 of them. And all these, of course, come from different branches, don't they? Like you might have got P45's copy and it was sent to you in another city. And that's the only bit you've got, the only copy of that part of the New Testament you've got. And therefore you create copies of it. So whatever mistakes it had,
I'm now going to be replicating.
You're going to be replicating. But probably when you see we the people, in order to create a perfect onion, are going to pause. I think, no, I think there's something going on here. And retrospectively, we can do that so easily because we've got so many other copies from that time period to allow us. You know, equally, you can imagine that there's another copy that's got something else wrong. You know, we the people, in order to create a more perfect anion. So obviously one was written by a cook and one was written by a chemist. And so, but once again, how do we know it wasn't meant to be an anion? Well, it doesn't make sense contextually and it doesn't match up with the vast bulk of others. And then, of course, we see that, let's make, say, P66, I don't know whether this is a great example or not, he's got beautiful handwriting. Is so incredibly faithful to the copy. And we can see that from P66, they've had this fortunate great line of purist, if you like. And then therefore you got a sense, okay, that could be a really good line to help guide us when decisions get a bit difficult. Because sometimes it is a little hard to know what the original is. There's a time in the Gospels where it talks about the chief priests and Pharisees came to arrest Jesus. Pretty small bit of phraseology, the chief priests and Pharisees. But there's one document that says something different. It says the chief priests and the Pharisees. And
where was the difference?
Where was the difference? I had to read it a few times. Okay, I see. The chief priests and, I'm saying it wrong now, the chief priests and Pharisees.
Yeah.
And the next one, the next group of documents, the chief priests and the Pharisees.
Just the is added.
Just the article. And people actually, professionals, will spend time saying, well, how many of the ancient copies actually have the word the, and how many of them don't have the word the, and why is there a the there? So you think, okay, you're going really deep now. Why do you think there's a word the there? Some of them will say, well, we think it's a harmonisation. You're going, oh, okay, this sounds a bit deep just for the. So what's a harmonisation? They say, well, what it is that we think that the person put the there deliberately because the other Gospels, when they talk about chief priests and Pharisees, they often talk about chief priests and the Pharisees. So he was probably trying to make his match up with Mark's wording or with John's wording. And someone else might say, no, I think he's just putting that particle there because earlier in this book they did talk about the Pharisees, and they'll talk about it to work out.
I think the common person would probably say, does it really matter?
Does it really matter? And that's what my book does. You know, does all of this matter? I tried to be really fair to show, does any of this matter to the doctrines that we follow? Now, doctrines is like a loaded word. Does this matter to our deep understanding about Jesus and what he did? Does this matter to the way we should live our lives if we want to show our thankfulness to Jesus for rescuing us? Does it really matter? I guess the first thing is I'm really glad that there are professionals who are so painstakingly nitpicky because it just adds to my confidence when I see that, wow, that's what you can spend all your time on, just the. And you're not sure whether that was deliberate or not. So that's another problem you've got. So sometimes it's a bit tricky to know whether it's intentional or not, but does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. There is a very controversial copy, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us about this one.
Everyone loves the controversy. Yeah. So this is a document, a copy of a copy called Codex Bezae Cantabrigiensis. Thankfully, it doesn't have a number, but unfortunately, it doesn't have a number because it's quite a long word.
What can we call it for short?
Sure. Well, Codex just means book.
Yep.
So in other words, it's not a scroll. Bezae is named after Theodore de Beze. He was the guy that first sort of brought it to light and made it come important in the 1500s. And Cantabrigiensis, because he gave it to a university at one stage in England. So Codex Bezae Cantabrigiensis, we can just call it Codex Bezae or Bezae's book, if you like, or Bezae's Bible, which would be very misleading, but let's just call it Codex Bezae then.
Okay.
So it's regarded when you read the Christian literature, the scholarly literature, and maybe some antagonistic websites, it's actually called the most controversial of all the copies.
And people would hear that and go, oh, I want to read about that.
Yeah, that's right. How to make somebody read the Bible. Here's the most controversial Bible you'll ever read. Should try that, actually. Anyway, so Codex Bezae Canterbury-Giensis, it wasn't written in the 300s, so it's a little bit later than some of those other ones I mentioned. It was written in the 400s, so pretty close to the others. Unfortunately, a lot of it's been lost. It's a bit unusual in that it's bilingual. One page is one language, one page is Greek, the Greek being the original language of the New Testament. What makes it fascinating is that it is so different to all the other families that we're talking about, all these streams that seem to have come off different originals that then got copied exponentially. So this one here, for instance, in the book of Acts, when you compare Codex Bezae with what we would say is the preferred archetype, so, you look at all the other copies and you think, well, we've looked at whether there should be a "the" there or a "the" not there. We've looked at whether this phrase should be there or not, and you come up with what you think is the original. When we compare that to Codex Bezae, we see some things that statistically look odd. So Codex Bezae has this book of Acts, which is basically the actions of all the disciples that followed Jesus after he was crucified and came back to life. And Codex Bezae doesn't have the last 7 or 8 chapters of Acts because it's been lost. So it's got about 21 chapters. It's missing chapter 9. But when you compare like for like, we see that Codex Bezae has 1,450 extra words in the book of Acts. It's also missing about 560 words, something like that, compared to what we think should have been the archetype. And when you look at these figures, you think, well, that seems really alarming now. So, imagine I'm in a Christian community and all I've got is Codex Bezae. Does that mean I'm going to be regarded as a cult compared to them because my doctrines are going to be so different because of all these extra words? So that's a position I put myself in when I was writing about this. I thought, okay, so if I've got this and I've just got the book of Acts, and let's say I've only got the first 4 chapters of the book of Acts, and already Codex Bezae has got a lot more words, even in those first 4 chapters.
Even the first 4? Okay.
I thought, well, what are the main doctrines coming out of that first 4 chapters, and are they different? So I actually went through them line by line, doctrine by doctrine. They're no different. So in both Bezae and what we think is the archetype, Jesus was crucified. Jesus was crucified so badly that he died. Jesus was resurrected. This was God's plan that he would be resurrected. Jesus was not just resurrected and just stayed on earth, but he went to heaven. Jesus didn't just go to heaven, but he's going to one day come back to earth, so in our future still. That when you become a Christian, something mystical spiritually happens to you. You are then indwelt by God. We say indwelt by the Holy Spirit, in fact. This is all in the first 4 chapters, remember.
Even with all the extra words.
Even with all the extra words. Yeah, this is what's fascinating. It's so still to the truth there. It talks about Jesus being the author of life, and especially for those of us who recognise that Jesus is God, who created the world, then reading that even in Codex Bezae, Acts chapter 3, verse 15, Jesus is still called the author of life. You can still use Codex Bezae's version of Acts chapter 4 to illustrate that Jesus is still God. So it's very powerful. And what I want to help people to see, therefore, is that going right back to the beginning, is that we really can, with great confidence, say that we've got an accurate and reliable record of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. He really did say that, and he really did do that. And I see this as very powerful because we often think that these doctrines about Jesus being God and the Creator are something that come from people theorising. But Jesus was a great teacher. We talked about how sometimes he'd repeat the same lesson, but he also did a thing called show and rather than tell. We often hear about a good novelist. will show you the plot, show you the character of the person rather than tell you the character. So rather tell you the nature of the character. So rather saying that, oh, this guy Brendan over here, he bashes his wife all day, he's a really horrible man, you just talk about some incidences in Brendan's life. And that tells enough, doesn't it?
It can be impactful enough.
That's right. You're showing the story, you're showing the audience or the reader, this is what life's like. You don't need to tell that he's evil in this particular case of wife abuse. So Jesus did that as well. He often showed more than he told, or I would say his showing was more powerful than his telling.
Okay, so can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, if you're patient with me, I'd love to give you 3. So very early on, we read in Jesus doing a miracle at a wedding where the hosts were running out of water and Jesus turned water into wine. Now, most people think about this in terms of, does that mean I can drink as a Christian or not? They have these sort of discussions. If Jesus made wine, maybe it's good, maybe it's not, depending on what your Christian community feels is appropriate sometimes. But the question is, why did Jesus turn water into wine? What was he showing? Well, when we look at God in creation, God made on day 3 the plants. Wine is just grape juice. It's just something, it is a plant product. Jesus was saying, I can turn water into a plant product, a very sophisticated plant product. This is something that I did when I created the world. I actually made plants out of something totally different. So this is Jesus not just pleasing somebody who's saying, please make us some wine. We didn't came to...
make the party go on longer.
Make the party go on longer. So I think he's showing rather than telling in that case. There's another example where Jesus walks on water. Now, some people will say, well, that's just him showing off. If I was him, I would have headed straight for the Gold Coast and gone surfing with a board. That would have been just so cool. Why walk when you could surf, But no, he went walking on the water. And we know this is a real account because it's historical. But why did he walk on water? Why didn't he walk in the air or walk on the clouds? Why didn't he roll over on it, Well, it's because in Job, which is one of the Old Testament books, Job chapter 9, verse 8, it says that Yahweh, which is the name for God, Yahweh is the only one that can tread on the waters of the sea. And so Jesus is saying to his Jewish audience, who all know their Old Testament, or their leaders do, that you know what I'm doing. You know why I'm doing this, and you've read in your Old Testament, well, they're your Bibles, and not their Old Testament, it's Christians' Old Testament, your Bibles, that only Yahweh can do this. What am I doing now? So he's showing rather than telling. And once again, you go all the way back to creation and day 3. The waters was separated, so there were the sea and the land. So he's harking back again. And I think the most obvious one, it puzzled me for many years, is in John chapter 9, Jesus is meeting a man that's been born blind. Very sad, especially in those days. And in order to heal the man, Jesus spits on the ground to make mud. Now, Jesus has sometimes healed people just by touching them. He's even healed other people by just giving the command that they be healed in whatever city they're at.
It has seemed like an odd detail every time I've read it.
Yeah, that's right. Why spit on the mud? That's a lot of bother. And then you're going to put that mud in the guy's face where his eyes are. And you think, well, that's pretty out there. If I was...
He could have just put his hands there and healed him.
That's right, or just done this, or not even done that, just said it's done. Well, when you think about what happened in Genesis, God made the first people, made Adam out of the dirt. And this is Jesus showing rather than telling. He's making one of the most sophisticated body parts, an eye, just out of the dirt. Just like we originally read about how God made Adam out of the dirt. So there is a lot of this teaching being taught, showing rather than telling, which also means that, yes, the individual words are really important. The Pharisees or Pharisees, I'm not so sure that's really important. But also so much of his message is revealed by what he did, not just what he said. Yeah.
So connect this back to our ability to be able to trust the words and the actions of Jesus and as they were written down. Can you do that for me, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I think we've seen today that we don't have to rely on a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a bad translation and then a copy of a copy of a copy of another bad translation. We, in this point in time, our Bibles are made looking at the copies that were made in Greek language. There's not been multiple translation issues for us. We're very blessed that way. Also, we've got a huge number of manuscripts. Sure, there is a huge number of changes, like the being there or the not being there, and some other changes. But we can because we got this big number, we can, if you like, put the jigsaw puzzle together so accurately. We've got the evidence that for them it was cultural, that when you had a teacher, you took notes. That's what they did there. And so just like I don't have to tell you that when I say my best friend went to the coast to go surfing, I don't have to tell you, and he hopped in his car to go surfing. They didn't have to say, and when we were listening to Jesus, we were taking notes. They just would have assumed that. We know that the Christian community were very blessed in that there were some people from their poor strata and some people from their rich strata that could read and write. We can see in the documents themselves that there's this restraint from making the disciples look like angels. You know, they're looking
they're
like
still stating the facts, even if there's...
That's right, yeah. And we know they're not even making Jesus look particularly great. Of course, at one stage, for no good reason, huge numbers of people walk away from him. So we're seeing this very realistic picture of Jesus. We would say in an English idiom, warts and all picture throughout the Bible. And I think these are powerful evidences to say that when we read, like John 14, verse 6, Jesus saying this statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father, to God, but through me. It can almost give us goosebumps to know that he really did say that. But what am I going to do with that? That's the next big question. What am I going to do with that?
And if someone were to say to you, John, okay, tell me something. What can I do with those very powerful words, or the implication of them is incredible? What would you encourage them to do?
We talked about how the evidence is that Jesus rose again. He's a living God. He's not just an historical figure. And we believe that he's an intervening God, and he wants to have relationship with people. So he loves us so much that even though we are not particularly good, or never will be particularly good, he still has loved us before we've shown any inclination to love him as we should. And you can talk to him. All you need to do is say, Jesus, I'm going to tell you as it is. I don't even know whether you're there. Help me to learn about you, but help me to know if you're real. You know, we should always speak to Jesus from your heart. If you're in a lot of pain physically, you should tell him, I'm in a lot of pain. I don't like this. If you're in a lot of emotional pain, you can tell him that. If you tell him that, I'd love to meet a Christian. I'd love to have someone who's been down this path for 10 years. I'd love to talk to them. And that's what we really encourage too. If you're thinking about getting right with Jesus, about asking him for forgiveness, then contact someone from Creation Ministries International. Contact a good pastor if you know of one, if you're fortunate enough to live in a place where there's a pastor nearby who's got a great reputation. And read the Bible. It's in so many different languages now. Read the Bible, and when you read it, just each time ask Jesus, help me to understand. Help me to understand. Yeah.
Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today.
Oh, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I really am, as you can see, I just cut you off. But I am so glad that I can help people to see that Jesus is alive and well. He's changed my life. He's turned me upside down. I want people to see that there's every reason to believe what you're reading is what he said.